All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for office hours. I see we have a number of people still connecting to audio, so come on in as that happens. Our agenda for today is pretty short. We have Deb Otis and Rob Ritchie from FairVote here to talk about multi-member districts, and then our own Bud Williams will be giving an update about Senate Bill 1 that just was released. So remember that you can always put any questions that you have in the chat as our speakers go along, or there's an opportunity to, come on camera or unmute yourself and share those questions at the end. You'll all notice that Wendy Underhill is not here today. I'm Mandy Zock, for those who don't know, and Wendy's on a much deserved vacation. So the rest of the team, we're all here and can answer any questions that you have. Ask questions. I like Ben's comment in the chat. We don't want to be sad. So ask us questions. It doesn't have to be about anything that our speakers talk about. You can ask any questions related to elections, redistricting, census. The reason we have these office hours is to be available and be a resource for everyone in the states. So don't be shy. But if you do want to ask a question anonymously, you can send it directly to me or one of the NCSL people, and we will read it without identifying you. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand it over to Rob and Deb. Take it away.
Well, thank you. I'm a huge fan of NCSL. Great chance to have a chance to speak with you. I am President and CEO of FairVote. Deb Otis is our senior researcher and analyst who does a lot of the great sort of in-depth work that we do, looking at how ranked choice voting worked in New York City, the roots of lack of competition in congressional elections, and so on. And we look at structural electoral reforms, and I think there's nothing more obvious to talk about relating to that right now than redistricting, single member districts, multi-member districts, because that's such a core construct for how we hold elections. So we put together a slide presentation, maybe somewhat ambitiously. We'll try to keep the time, and I'm going to start and then pass it over to Deb. So I'll share my screen and see if this works as anticipated. And so we're going to focus in particular, if everyone's seen that screen, on the idea of fair representation within the House, which of course is a general goal, but there's a specific proposal that we think kind of fundamentally would change how we achieve that and take so much pressure off of the way we draw district lines and essentially establish voters as in control of our representation. So it sort of shifts from fair maps to fair votes. Thinking about the nation as a in our history, we have an old democracy, which is great, and a constitution that goes back to the 1700s. One of the challenges is that there weren't really many electoral systems that people could look at then. Our founders were really cutting edge at the time and looking at all the best practices and ideas, but they were pretty limited on what they could structurally look at, which so they wisely created the space for us over time to achieve the objectives that they laid out. This one, quote from John Adams, is his suggestion of what we want legislatures to look like. And I think it's a nice expression of what the consent of the governed really means, but it's that portrait of the people. And I think we would argue single member districts is not the best vehicle to get there. I think it's pretty easy to believe that things aren't working out right now as we'd like them to. I'm sure members of Congress are discouraged when they have 17% rates of approval for all the work that they're trying to do. And we think it's sort of tied to the incentives that lead to certain behaviors. And we try not to blame the people, but sort of look at why people seem to be acting in certain ways and how people see that. But just some of the symptoms of things, I think this laundry list is ones that we are all sort of aware of. But limited voter choice. We do this Monopoly Politics report. Deb did the most recent edition where we can predict almost 90% of House races immediately after the last election, except in this cycle when there's redistricting. The issues of voters not being able to vote authentically the way they want. When more than two candidates run, you get split votes and non-representative winners. This doom loop of toxicity that we're seeing, where each round of elections seems to be creating more fear and concern about the other party, gerrymandering, distortions in representation. And we believe it is getting worse. It's sort of worse in a way that I think it's really deserves this conversation that we're starting to see. So multi-member districts are actually not a new idea at all. A lot of people think they're sort of baked into the Constitution. They're not. A lot of early Congresses for the first 50 years were at-large elections. At this state level, 41 states as recently as the 50s had at least some multi-member state legislative districts. Currently, 9 still do. And they're all winner-take-all as they're currently used. And we'll sort of explain what winner-take-all versus non-winner-take-all means. But they're very common at the local level, in fact, more common than single-member districts. And there are some more differences as far as having some non-winner-take-all, elections. So one of the things that's sort of basically different about the multi-member district, in this little graphic of showing like 6 people who are in a single-member district in Louisiana, and then what it means to be running in larger districts, is that you sort of can run as teams, you can serve as teams, you can represent more people. Voters can have more opportunities to feel like their representative might be akin to them rather than just having one. There's obviously a trade-off every time you do one thing versus another, but multi-member districts have often been seen as valuable for that reason. There's been some interesting impacts as far as women winning more with multi-member districts. Oops, I realize I'm advancing the slide without meaning to. Sorry about that. I think I'll hold on this slide for a second. That women have historically done significantly better multi-member districts. It's not an always the case situation, but again, when people are running those teams versus not, and you still see that in state legislatures. Now, we often think about multi-member districts through the lens of voting rights cases and how there could be kind of a tyranny of the majority, right? So if there's a 55% majority in a certain area, a town or a county, and they have the power to elect every seat in an at-large election, that can deprive other people of a chance to win seats. But there are times when that racial polarization isn't as intense, and then you actually have a history of some very interesting cross-racial coalitions and people kind of electorally using the fact that they can run as teams to win as teams. The one interesting history at the state legislative level that we had was different, was Illinois had cumulative voting in multi-member districts up until from 1870 to 1980. Came out of the Civil War. They wanted to have both parties being able to win seats together across the state and not be polarized like the country just had been. And it really worked that way. So they had Republicans and Democrats representing almost every district. The difference was, rather than needing 50% to win in a multi-member district, it took about a quarter of the vote to win. And just that change kind of opened up representation in quite an interesting way. When they changed to a smaller House, in 1980, they decided to go to single-member districts, and a lot of people feel that change has been a problem for the state. So we touched on some of those benefits about how it's different. I would say that when you get into the Fair Representation Act proposal, I think we can go deeper into what some of those benefits are. Just on the one particular piece of the ballot, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about ranked choice voting, something that FairVote has worked on throughout its history, along with making this case for changing single member districts. But the ballot changes so you don't just tick one person. You are able to express your preferences, first choice, second choice, and third choice. And that very act of saying, well, who do I want as my backup choice in case my first choice can't win? I'll go down to a third choice. It's up to the voter. They don't have to do rankings, but they can. And that changes the conversation with candidates, because now they know, even if I can't get a first choice from that person, I might be able to get a second choice, and that might help me win. And that change really, we've seen this play out again and again now, encourages candidates to just talk with more voters. It's something that we're seeing. 23 cities in Utah signed up to use ranked choice voting this November. It was used in New York City for all its big primaries, including the mayoral race. And it was used by the Virginia Republicans to do all their big nominations this past spring. And I think you can see some of the values that we think it does. When you add in the multi-winner aspect, that's when you start to really change the incentives in different ways for not only how those voters behave, but what kind of representation they have the power to achieve. And the core difference, again, is like going from needing 50% to win to 25% to 20% and so on. I'm going to let Deb, I think this next slide goes into her presentation. And Deb, shall I click for you, or do you want to take over the presentation at this point?
Thanks, Rob. Why don't you keep screen sharing and you can click for me.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Good.
All right, so this is an image of our proposal for the US House of Representatives. We'll talk a little bit more today as well about implementing this on a state-by-state level. But I do want to initially look at this from the US level. So FairVote right now is working for a piece of legislation called the Fair Representation Act. You will see at the bottom of the slide the bill number in the current Congress. And so as Rob described, the switch from single member districts to multi-member districts has a lot of huge impacts for representation, for how many people are having their voices heard and able to cast an impactful vote. But it's a step beyond just needing multi-member districts. We also need to add the proportional ranked choice voting in order to ensure we're electing the right winners from these multi-winner districts. And so we'll talk about these two aspects here, how they go together. But I briefly wanted to touch on the state of Massachusetts. I lived in Massachusetts for about 10 years. There's a good reason that they are the example that we picked for this slide. First, you'll notice in the top left, that is Massachusetts as it is now with 9 single winner districts. Bottom right, Massachusetts as we think it should be. This is one example of how it might look under fair representation voting. And so in the former Massachusetts, the top left, you'll notice all of these members are from the same party. They're all blue, they're all Democrats. We do think of Massachusetts as a pretty blue state, but when it comes down to it, about 40% of the voters are supporting the other party, and they end up with 0 representation. So we have a one-party delegation here. And we see similar things for states on the other side of the aisle, of course. And so that's one issue here. But a much bigger issue is that gerrymandering cannot solve it. Single member districts cannot fix the problem in Massachusetts. We partner with an organization called MGGG out of Tufts University. They recently did a report trying to draw districts that would be fair to Republicans in Massachusetts. They found out that it was not possible. Massachusetts does not have the same geographic sorting between the parties that you see in some locations. So even if the district drawers had the best intention to get representation that was about equal to voter preferences, in this state, single winner districts just cannot get you there. So that's why we need a different solution. This can help us escape from the battles during the district drawing cycle, and will help voters' voices matter more. So next slide, please. As we go through this, please keep the questions coming. Rob might be able to attack some of those in the chat for you, and then we'll leave time to both answer them at the end, of course. So I'm going to go through an example of how ballots are counted in multi-winner ranked choice voting. I suspect some folks here are familiar with the single winner form. It's the form that New York City just used, as well as the state of Maine and dozens of other cities, counties, and states around the country. But this today is the advanced RCV course, because we're talking about the multi-winner version, which is also known as proportional ranked choice voting. So you may know in single winner ranked choice voting, we would end up eliminating last place candidates until you get a majority winner. If we're electing multiple winners, we don't need a majority, we just need a certain threshold. So in this example, this is a district that's going to elect 3 winners. So the threshold is any candidate who gets over 25% of the vote wins a seat. And so that threshold varies based on how many folks are being elected in a district. This is a 3-winner example. So first, we counted up just everyone's first choice votes, and we see somebody is winning already. Light blue gets one of these 3 seats. They have crossed the threshold. Congrats, light blue. But they have more votes than they need. Imagine if you were a light blue voter. You cast your vote for your favorite candidate. then you saw this result, you would say, oh no, light blue could have won without my help. Maybe I should have voted for someone else to try to, dilute the strength and maybe get two of my favorite candidates in. Well, that's a problem in our old system. Ranked choice voting is going to solve that problem. Excess votes beyond what a candidate needs are going to get transferred to those people's second choices. This is called a single transferable vote method. Everyone gets one vote, but if your first choice doesn't need your vote to win, your vote stays in play and can help your next choice. So in round 2, we see that those extra blue votes have transferred. This blue faction, there are a lot of voters there, may be enough that they deserve 2 seats on this council. So we're going to listen to all of those blue voters. So this was round 2. I'm looking for 3 winners to cross that threshold. I don't have any more winners yet. We just have that first one. So let's head on to round 3. We're going to eliminate that last place candidate, this magenta, transfer those ballots to those people's next choice. We kept their first choice in play for as long as we could, but ultimately that person didn't get enough support, but those voters can support their next choice candidate. So those votes are transferred, and now we have 3 winners at or above the threshold. So those are the 3 people we elected. This is how you get proportionality. And this is how every voter gets a vote that is equally impactful. So anyone want to ask any questions about that tabulation? Not seeing immediate questions, we could move on to a quick case study.
And maybe I'll just add, Deb, leading into your case study, this is used quite a number of countries. It's used by every single voter in one of their governmental elections, sometimes the biggest election in Australia, Ireland, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Malta, which has the highest voter turnout in the world when without compulsory voting, and several cities in the US, as Deb's about to talk about one of them.
Could I ask a question, please?
So Thomas, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, with the proportion being 25%, was that number chosen because there were 4 candidates, or is that arrived at it differently?
That number is based on the number of seats to be elected. So we're electing 3 seats. And so the threshold is set such that as soon as 3 candidates have crossed the threshold, a 4th candidate cannot then get that same number of votes to be elected. It's like if you're electing just 1 candidate, you need more than half the votes. Well, if you're electing 2 candidates, then you need more than 1/3 of the votes. 3 candidates, you need more than 1/4 of the votes to win.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Other questions on that? All right, well, I'd love to quickly talk about Cambridge, Massachusetts then. They use this at the municipal level. They have been doing it since the 1940s. So they are our longest continuous use case of proportional ranked choice voting in the US. And we've seen some really strong results there. One of the things that is great to see as a researcher for ranked choice voting, I love being able to dig into the data of where this has been used and how it is working in practice. And what we've seen, Cambridge is a diverse city in terms of income diversity, education diversity, racial diversity, you name it. And their city council has kept up with that, with changing demographics and changing viewpoints in the city without anyone ever having to go and redraw district lines to keep communities together or anything like that. The proportional ranked choice voting effectively does it for them and keeps the diversity of the council shifting and matching the diversity of the voters, even as the city changes. And so what we see when we dig into these results, 95% of voters see one of their top 3 choices elected. And that is great for representation. Almost everyone is getting at least one of their top choices. We also see a similar portion of voters who are choosing to engage with this ranked ballot by ranking multiple candidates. When given the option, voters tend to want to do that. They are excited to express multiple preferences. And lastly, I included this map here because neighborhood representation is a goal that sometimes people bring up when they want to draw districts. But I want to show that it can happen even when you're not drawing districts. So Cambridge does not draw districts because they elect at large using this form of proportional ranked choice voting. But this map shows by ward, the first choices of folks in that ward, as well as the home addresses of the winners from that year. And as you can see, the winners are spread out throughout the city. And we see first choices for individual candidates tend to cluster in geographic areas, although of course we see some moving around. And so these are factions of voters that are in the same neighborhood or in the same community, tend to express similar preferences, and they get a seat, they get a representation from their own neighborhood without every 10 years someone having to go and redraw the lines. So that's just a quick study on how it's working in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're very interested in seeing this happen in state legislatures. We think state legislative bodies is a great opportunity for this form of proportional representation. And we at FairVote, one of our big priorities over the next few years is trying to implement this federally. One of my favorite aspects is reducing the impact of gerrymandering. One, we're drawing fewer lines, so that helps. Two, the lines just don't matter as much. The voters' voices are heard because of this ranked choice voting. And so it's much less impactful for a district drawer to try to split up a community. It does not have the same impact with multi-winner districts as it would in single winner. So our legislation proposes independent redistricting commissions, but the impact of even drawing those lines in the first place is drastically reduced. So we can avoid these big battles we have every 10 years. We've also seen multi-member districts and ranked choice voting both lead to improved representation for women and for people of color. The number of districts in the US in which people of color would have the power to elect a candidate of their choice increases by about 50% if we implement the Fair Representation Act. And so we're excited to see those outcomes for people of color and for women, getting our elected bodies to look more like the voters. And lastly, shared representation within districts can create good governance incentives. And so I think those are some key facts. This is the end of our prepared presentation, but Rob and I would love to take questions. Rob, do you have anything else to add before we open it up?
I think we touched on it well. We raced through it. Let me stop sharing so we can get back. Oh my goodness, you can see my music there. There we go. Where are we? I lost. Is somebody able to seize it from NCSL and take back control, or do I need to somehow give it back to you?
That was a good question. I think you need to.
Let me see if I can do this.
See all of your tabs. So I see that we have at least one question in the chat. Another was sent to me, and Jeff's hand is raised. So let's start with Emily's question in the chat, and then we'll go to Jeff. So Emily wrote, once this type of voting system has been implemented, how do government officials and other groups go about educating the public about how it works? It seems to me that there would be a big learning curve for the average voter. So thoughts, Rob, Deb?
Oh, I'll start, and Deb, please add to it. I think, let me sort of break it down into different components. So one is with multi-member districts, actually who represents you will in fact become more stable, right? You will be, of course it is with over a course of a decade, but the district lines will be less likely to move you into a new district. Like you will be in a kind of a more continuous representation, because again, we're trying to draw fewer district lines. So that piece of it is actually sort of greater continuity. I in Maryland have 3 delegates in the House of Delegates, and some people say, oh, who do you know how to contact? It's like, well, I have 3. It's kind of fun, right now I can talk. I can talk to one because I think that person's really good on that kind of issue, and another on another. But there's sort of a new relationship with constituents that's actually very similar to the U.S. Senate if people are engaging with their 2 senators or in a number of state legislators. The ballot itself, we now have a lot of introductions of ranked choice voting. It's now used in over 50 jurisdictions in the United States right now. Again, being introduced to more than 20 cities in Utah that hadn't used it before, 2 that had. New York City just used it for the first time, and there's getting to be kind of a nice set of things to do. You also have to work with the election officials so they are ready to implement the system. That's a new one. You've got to work out procedures for that, and there are lessons to learn from how to do that better than not. Good ballot designs, but I think again, things that are being learned. And the voters really, I think, find the ranked ballot very intuitive. In fact, it reflects in some ways how we think more than just being limited to one. Like for any of you who have engaged in a contest where there was more than one person that you had something to say about, limiting to one is in fact not as expressive, right? And you're feeling constrained by that. So I think as long as people can get to the point of feeling comfortable that authentically indicating their preferences is the right thing to do, voters seem to do that very, very well. And you got to work with the candidates. They can be the biggest sources of misinformation. So work with the candidates, and that's a big head start.
Great, thank you. Jeff, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me on the audio?
Yep.
Great. First of all, I want to say hello to Rob, who's an old friend and colleague. I have two questions. The first, this goes back to the multi-member district question, how your proposal might impact minority districts, especially if it's determined that a certain geographical area needs, let's say 50, 51% minority voting age population. Would using a multi-member scheme make it more difficult to elect a minority candidate? And second, curious, I looked at your map for Massachusetts, and just disclaimer, I was counsel to the Massachusetts Senate when that map was created. Question is, have you created any other maps looking at, let's say, the 2011 iterations of, excuse me, North Carolina or Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, just to see how many Democrats might get elected where they can't get elected now? Thank you.
Well, and I bet Deb might have a little more to add to that too. But one, great to see you, Jeff. And so really fundamental to this is that we're changing from a system where it takes over 50% of the vote to be sure of winning to one where it takes a lower percentage of the vote to win, right? So if it's 3 seats, like in those Massachusetts districts, if you get over 25%, you can be sure of winning. If it's a 5-member district, the math would put you about 17%. Now, if you apply that math to, say, all the big states in the South, where there's substantial populations of African Americans, but typically kind of only 1 or 2 African American majority seats possible in those districts, leaving actually in almost all those states a majority of African Americans outside of those districts. And you just say in a North Carolina, create three districts, so 3 to 5 people. Every single African American is in a position to help elect a preferred candidate using that math of needing 15 to 25%, as is every white voter as well, and every Republican voter and every Democratic voter, right? It's this shared representation potential. In fact, if you look, there's a way to have every state from California to Maryland, a connected series of states where every single district would have the math potential, right? The power to elect for both a racial minority and a white voter in every single part of every one of those states, which is different, obviously, than what we have now. And it sort of liberates it by putting voters in charge, which I think, given where the Supreme Court is on Section 2 and obviously where we are with lack of Section 5 enforcement, I think that this kind of turning it over to the voters kind of takes a lot of the heat out of the judicial process and the contention out of districting, and in fact creates a lot of new opportunities. Just to not be so Pollyannish that it's just perfect, is that the power to elect comes with needing to vote, right? People need to participate. And so the power to elect is there in sheer shares of the population or of eligible voters. But of course, voters need to be participating and candidates need to run. But assuming that happens, and that is an assumption that needs to be carried out, it is actually creates real opportunities for uptick. And we do have model states. We've in fact done a 50-state map that we used in 2017. In fact, used a tool that without our touching the buttons or whatever, we just set up the criteria of the Fair Representation Act and let this system, this kind of computer, roll and create districts. We didn't love every district, but we were letting it kind of create districts that gave an example, and it actually produced that kind of impact of big upticks for people of color being able to help elect someone, and kind of a real balancing in all kinds of states, right? Meaning that Oklahoma suddenly has opportunities for Democrats, and a Connecticut for Republicans, and so on, and creates overall equity for partisan representation.
Great. Sorry, I couldn't have my mute button there. Just a reminder that if you have questions, you can ask them, put them in the chat. Thank you for that, Rob. I think we have one more question, and others may come along as people think. If Rob, you and Deb want to share your email addresses in the chat, people could also follow up with you directly if things are percolating and they want to follow up on a question. The other one is about kind of this multi-member districting solution. So this is what you've proposed is different than the non-geographic proportional representation systems used in European parliaments in Israel. So why is sticking with districting schemes desirable?
Great question. Let's first start with sort of Congress, right? So, 25 states have 5 or fewer seats, right? So we already, and we're not changing the Constitution. This is all within the Constitution, by the way, completely statutory. And I'll say just parenthetically, very consistent with why we use single member districts today. We use single member districts today because Congress, the first time they did this was in the 1840s. They were looking at this fracturing of how people were electing House members, some at large, some single member districts. So sort of at large gerrymanders going on, like using winner take all to win all the seats. And they said, well, let's have a nationally fair standard. Everyone has to use single member districts. So that was their sense of quote unquote fairness. And then that actually expired at one point in the 1920s. So there was a lot of a time in our history in the 20th century when you could use that large elections, and some states did. And then in the 1960s, after we had the apportionment rulings, there was a requirement to say, or where you had to have district lines be equitably or equal populations and draw districts more often. Well, let's make sure that doesn't lead to manipulation, particularly with African Americans suddenly getting voting rights in the South, and avoid the temptations of winner take all at large to distort outcomes. So again, let's have a national fair system of single member districts. I think that hasn't worked out as well as we would like. And I think if we want a national fair system, this is actually a fair system. Now, it works within our culture. We think, one, these are candidate-based systems, right? So it's not a party-based system. You're not voting for a party ahead of a candidate. You can rank according to your wishes. I think a lot of people would rank according to a party label in general elections, but they don't have to, right? They could pick their favorite Democrat followed by a favorite Republican, and so on as a backup choice. And it is consistent with our values there. A lot of other countries have an expectation that on the floor of their parliament, everyone in that party will just always vote according to the instructions of the party leadership and the decisions that they've made in caucus. And that's not what our culture historically has been. This allows that kind of differentiation within the parties. A thinker named Yuval Levin, right, talks really well about this sense of like, these are Madisonian kind of factions in a positive sense within the parties that can be different within our big tents and sort of operate within our historical norms of having parties not being monochrome or just sort of all the same, but having people have their differentiation. So that's sort of candidate-based, still respecting geography, but not letting geography overwhelm voters, and sort of trying to find what we think is a sweet spot that works well within our culture.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for this presentation, for answering these questions, and for sharing your email addresses in the chat. Glad to learn much more about this particular topic. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to